Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are following the path of the sun across the Egyptian sky to meet Ra, the god of light and life. In the stories told along the Nile, Ra rises from the primeval waters, brings the world into being, and sails the heavens by day before entering the underworld by night. He is Khepri at dawn, Ra at noon, and Atum at evening. He is the power behind kingship and the keeper of cosmic order, the one who faces the great serpent, Apep in the dark, and returns with the morning. We will explore his birth from the waters of Nun, his solar bark, and the 12 hours of night, the eye of Ra, and the fury of Sekhmet, the return of the distant goddess, and how Ra joined with Amun to become Amun-Ra. We will see how pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra, how temples and hymns honored him, and how this single god shaped the rhythm of Egyptian life for thousands of years. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Settle in, let your thoughts slow, and follow the light. In the beginning, there was not a beginning so much as an endless possibility. There was only the deep black water called Nun. It had no shore and no wind and no sound. Imagine a night without stars that goes on forever, a vastness that is not even empty because emptiness is a kind of thing and none was older than things. Out of that stillness, a rise of land lifted itself like the crown of a turtle. This first hill was the sacred mound, the Ben-Ben, a shimmer of earth where nothing had ever stood. On that gleam of new ground, a brilliant presence came into being by the power of its own will. He was Atum. He was Ra. He was the complete one and the first light. He did not need a mother or a father. He was his own origin. The Egyptians, who were kindly to mysteries, said that Atum brought forth his children in the most direct way possible. With mind and magic and the creative member, he generated life. He also created by speech. Words in Egypt were not labels for things. Words were spells that called those things into existence. The act of naming was an act of making. When he spoke the names of air and moisture, they became real. When he thought of companionship, the twin powers stepped forth as if from a doorway. Thus came Shu, the bright, dry breath, and Tefnut, the sweet damp that settles on grass at dawn. They were not metaphors to the Egyptians. They were the very essences. Shu was the lift in the lungs and the space between earth and sky. Tefnut was the glisten on the reed and the tenderness of rain. Atum blessed them and sent them into the new world to explore its edges. The world at that time had very few edges. There is a story that the twins wandered too far and did not return. The first father missed them. He took out his eye, which was not a simple ornament but a living goddess, fierce and loyal, and he sent her to seek his children. When Shu and Tefnut came home, the eye found Atum with another eye already in place. The returning eye became angry and wept. Where the tears fell upon the fresh ground, human beings rose up. This is why the people of Egypt sometimes called themselves the cattle of Ra, children of his tears, warmed by his daily kindness, and often in need of herding. From the embrace of air and moisture came a new pair. Geb was the earth, green of skin in painted reliefs, fertile and heavy, and laughing with grain. Nut was the sky, arched in a glittering span, her body star-strewn, her limbs touching the horizons. They loved one another so closely that there was no world between them. Shu, who was always the spacemaker, eased them apart, lifting Nut above and pressing Geb below, and in that widening breath all creatures found room to live. The Egyptians drew this as a simple and perfect scene. The man of earth lies smiling. The woman of sky forms a shining bridge. Between them stands air with his arms raised, the eternal pillar. The children of earth and sky were 5. Osiris, who would become the green lord of growth and the kindly judge of the dead. Isis, peerless in craft and love, mistress of words and healing. Seth, the loud storm and the red violence of the desert. Nephthys, dusk and devotion, and the silence of shrines. Horus, the elder, the far-seeing skyhawk. In later ages, another Horus would be born to Isis. But in the ancient family of Heliopolis, this elder Horus belonged to the first company. These 9 divine beings, beginning with Atum and ending with the 4 younger ones, formed the Ennead, the company of 9, the court and kin of the first king. Ra is king in this early time, not by conquest but by sheer vitality. He is the blaze that draws a line between darkness and day. He is the pace of the world. As dawn he is Khepri, the scarab who rolls the sun across the horizon, a patient god who teaches that beginnings are a kind of labor. At noon he is Ra in his full strength, falcon-headed and crowned with the sun disk encircled by the protective serpent, who is also his power made visible. At evening he is Atum again, old and satisfied, leaning on a staff, the sun lowering itself like an ember into the western cradle. These are not different gods fighting for attention. They are masks of a single presence. The day seen in 3 acts. He did not create only the gods, and the sky, and the green. He fashioned the tools by which creation would endure. Mart was his most precious gift. Mart is not a person, and yet she is a goddess. She is truth and proportion and the rightness of things. She is the balance on the scales and the feather that measures the heart. When Ra breathes, Mart rides on his breath. When a scribe writes a contract or a farmer lines up his furrows with the river, they call on Mart. Without her, the Nile would forget its season, the courts would go blind, and the sun would lose its road. In some tellings, a radiant bird alights upon the Benben at the first sunrise. It is the Bennu, with a long cry that breaks the old stillness and sets time in motion. The bird is a sign of renewal and a promise that the day will return. On many temple roofs, priests kept a stone shaped like the top of an obelisk to echo that first mound. It caught the morning light. It said, "This is where creation began and begins again each day." There were other cities with other stories, because Egypt was a long country with many holy places. In Memphis, the craftsman declared that Pa shaped the world with thought and tongue. In Thebes, the priests favored Amun, the hidden one, as the source of creation. But even there, the brightness of Ra was welcomed. Egypt loved agreement more than quarrel. Theologies braided themselves together the way reeds are worked into a single mat. Atum, the complete one, Ra, the sun, Khepri, the coming into being, many names, one blaze. The early myths insist that creation is both intimate and immense. It begins with a solitary god on a small island of earth, and it becomes a family tree whose branches are sky and land and the green things between. The gods are not abstractions. They are the anatomy of the world. If you breathe, you know Shu. If you sit by the river at dawn, you feel Tefnut on your skin. When you plant, you place your trust in Geb. When you lift your eyes at night, you look into the body of Nut. Above them shines the one who first spoke their names, and in speaking made them real. The sun rises, and with it rises the story of life. From this blessed arrangement flows a last important truth of the first chapter. The gods are not only brilliant and endlessly alive, they are also bound to care for what they made. Ra is not a distant light. He is a presence who hears prayers, who visits shrines every morning in the hands of his priests, who looks out through the guardian eye to see that order is kept. Creation is not a single act. It is a duty performed daily. That is why the Egyptians watched the sunrise with relief and gratitude. It meant that the first promise still held. If the first spark of creation was a solitary radiance on a small eminence of earth, the second act was legislation on a cosmic scale. The Egyptians gave a name to that glittering inauguration of order. They called it the first time. In that sacred moment, Ra did not simply blaze. He arranged. A king does not rule by warmth alone. He rules by measure and boundary and vow. Ra lifted his gaze and laid out the two horizons like gates of light. He drew a road for the sun across the body of the sky, and he assigned places for the planets that wander and for the stars that move with proper dignity. He declared that the vault above would arch and the earth below would rise to meet it in fields and deserts and riverbanks. He enthroned Maat not as a suggestion, but as the living statute of reality. Truth was not only a virtue in Egypt, truth was a structure. It was the line a mason snaps in chalk and the plumb that finds the center of a wall. To secure this order, Ra summoned three powers that would forever travel with him. Sia was perception, the divine intelligence that knows each thing by its essence. Hu was authoritative utterance, the command that sets a thing in its right place. Heka was magic, not a parlor trick, but the energy that makes a spoken law take root in stone and in the heart. With Sia to know, with Hu to decree, and with Heka to make it so, the cosmos ceased to be a bright accident and became a kingdom. Order demanded time, and time needed a story. In one of the oldest of these stories, Ra found himself a stern lawgiver. The sky goddess Nut loved the earth god Geb with such constancy that her belly of stars pressed close to his green laughter. Ra saw that the world would never grow if birth and death did not enter its rhythm, so he declared that Nut should not give birth on any day of the year. It sounds cruel, but gods are often strict when they are trying to make a world. The remedy did not come from wrath, but from wit. Thoth, who counts and measures, who keeps the writing of the gods, went to the moon and wagered at a game until he won a little of its light. With that borrowed glow, he crafted 5 new days that sat neatly outside the perfect circle of the old year. On those extra days, Nut brought forth her children. Some traditions say Osiris first, then Horus the Elder, then Seth, then Isis, then Nephthys. Others vary the order, as Egypt often did, but the meaning is constant. The births arrive. The year grows from 360 to 365, and time itself learns how to make room for surprise. Long after, farmers watched the bright star Sopdet rise just before dawn to announce the Nile flood, and they knew that the sky and the river were keeping the same calendar. The year advanced through 3 great seasons: inundation when the waters spread their gift, emergence when the ground drank and greened, and heat when the harvest was stored. Ra had not only made days, he had braided them to the river and the fields so that human life would have a reliable pulse. A world that keeps time also needs shape. The Egyptians told another beginning in the city of Hermopolis. There, the oldest memory speaks of 8 shadowy beings who swam in the primeval waters. They were darkness and endlessness and hiddenness in male and female pairs. From their motion, a lotus rose, and when its flower opened, the first child of the sun lifted his face, a golden child on a floating throne, and the world exhaled as if for the first time. In Heliopolis, the sign of origins was the Ben-Ben stone. Priests placed conical stones on temple roofs so that the first light would strike and cling to them. An obelisk is exactly this truth made into architecture. It is a petrified ray of the sun, a proof in granite that light has weight. Far to the south at Elephantine, potters watched the river turn around the sacred island and saw in its smooth eddies the hands of Khnum, the ram-headed craftsman who formed human bodies on his wheel and set in each the breath of life and a soul to keep it company. When the river swelled and spread, the kindly god Hapi went laughing through the channels with papyrus and fish spilling in his wake. When the river withdrew again, he left behind a dark and generous silt that taught the land to feed everyone who asked courteously. In these scenes, the gods are not distant supervisors. They are the grammar of place. A bend in the Nile is an idea in the mind of a potter god. A pillar of light is an oath that stone has sworn to the Sunday. The order of heaven called for the order of temples. To raise a house for a god was not to indulge a fancy. It was to repeat the first time so that the present could keep working. Every foundation began with a rite called stretching the cord. The king stood with a stake and a mallet. Beside him was Seshat, narrow and attentive, wearing the star flower above her brow. Together they drew out a cord to mark the axis of the building, and they set the corners by the watching stars. The walls would rise according to those lines, not because geometry is fussy, but because geometry is faithful. A temple is a map of the cosmos in stone. Its pylon gate is the horizon. Its roof is the body of Nut with her stars painted in a deep blue heaven. Its inner chambers are the primeval darkness before the first dawn. A darkness that is not menacing because it is the womb of light. When priests carried the small gold bark of the god around the courtyards and back into the hidden sanctuary, they were not performing a theater piece. They were coaxing the day itself to keep moving. When the morning light touched the altar, when the incense rose like a new cloud, the building and the sky agreed to continue the conversation they began at the start of the world. Names were fitted to things with as much care as stones were fitted to walls. The Memphite theologians, who loved craft as the highest art, said that Ptah conceived the forms of all in his heart and spoke them onto the stage of being with his tongue. The Heliopolitan priests would not have quarreled. They would have smiled and said that Ra did much the same when he called the first company into life by the power of a word. A true name is not a label. It is the private address of a thing by which it knows itself. This is why a hymn is more than praise, and why a spell is more than a request. To speak rightly is to take part in the making of the world. The Egyptians revered this with a seriousness that modern ears sometimes miss. They wrote lists of names for the sun at dawn and at noon and at dusk, because each moment of the day carries a different facet of the same brilliance, and only the correct address will do. When a ritual says the priest offers Ma'at to Ra, what he carries is not a small figurine, but the entire principle of order presented back to its author, a way of saying we remember the contract and we will keep it with you. From these arrangements flow the institutions that would sustain Egypt for 3,000 years. A king is not merely a fortunate warrior in this setting. He is the officer of Ma'at, the steward of the balance between flood and famine and between justice and ruin. Calendars are not wall ornaments. They are the memory of vows first sworn when the lotus opened and when the Ben took the sun on its brow. The temple is not an escape from the world. It is the blueprint by which the world is kept. And above these working truths, the sun makes his daily crossing, renewed at each horizon, watched and sung to and greeted with relief by people who understand that creation is not a past event but the work of every hour. There is a particular hush that belongs to early morning on the Nile, a blue quiet just before birds begin their bargaining with the light. Imagine a reed bed breathing mist, cattle lowing on a sandbank, a fisherman untangling his net with the same care a scribe uses to unroll a scroll. Now imagine the eastern horizon kindling as if some invisible hand were drawing a red thread along the lip of the sky. That is Ra making his appearance, not as a distant lantern, but as a sovereign moving through his country. In the oldest memory of Egypt, there was a time when this sovereign did not simply rise over the world. He ruled the world in person. The Egyptians called this the first time, and though it belonged to myth, it was not quaint. It was a charter. It explained why the day behaves, why the flood keeps its promise, why the grain rises in green ranks from black earth, and why power, properly understood, is not a shout but a discipline. Ra did not merely shine, he governed. He set the terms by which light would be law, and law would be life. To speak of governance in Egypt is to speak of Maat with a respect that borders on devotion. Maat is not a code scribbled by anxious officials. Maat is the alignment of the universe with itself, the right relation of breath to body and river to field and ruler to ruled. Ra established Maat as the breath of reality, and he made it visible as a feather set on the scales of judgment so that even the least of us might grasp its delicacy. The myths portray this as a living exchange. At dawn, the priests present Maat to Ra as an offering, which is a way of saying that order is not merely bestowed from above. Order is accepted and upheld by the community that benefits from it. The offering is not pretty formality. It is a renewal of the covenant between heaven and Bali. When it is kept, paddles dip evenly, scribes write clearly, granaries exhale the smell of last season's stores, and the courts do not forget the poor. When it is broken, the river sulks in its banks, the desert advances like a bad rumor, and the sun seems to catch on the horizon as if the hinges of the day had rusted. So the people honored Maat as if the health of their lungs depended on it, which, in a manner of speaking, it did. Under that regimen of brightness, the world did not simply survive. It became organized. The gods of the Ennead took up their assignments as if a new court had been sworn in. Thoth, thin and wise and implacably tidy, kept the books of divine things in order so that reckoning might be possible. Seshat, who wears the starflower, kept the lines straight on earth so that temples would mirror the sky. Ptah in Memphis gathered the ideas of all things into his heart and let them out with his tongue, which is an Egyptian way of saying that craft is the elaboration of thought in matter. Khnum shaped the bodies of mortals and the forms of their destinies on a potter's wheel that spins with a sound like the river at rapids. Hapi kept the flood kind without becoming careless. Osiris taught cultivation and the just arrangement of property, which is the difference between a harvest and a riot. Isis taught medicine and the use of names, which is the difference between a cure and a superstition. Even the untamed gods took service. Seth, loud as sand on the wind, guarded the bark of the sun through the perilous hours of night, because even a desert must sometimes be hired as a watchman. In this staffed and humming universe, Ra was the organizing will behind every appointment. The myths describe him strolling through gardens with his beloved children, or sitting in a pavilion whose pillars were painted to resemble papyrus and lotus, or sailing in a ceremonial boat whose deck was bright with electrum. These are not only pretty images, they are statements that the best of human environment is a cultivated echo of the eternal environment, and that it is the task of kingship to hold those echoes in tune. If the gods were the principles behind the scenery, the land itself was an instrument tuned to their pitch. The Nile is an essay on Maat written in water. It rises when the distant rains have accomplished their work, swells into the fields with a courteous insistence, withdraws, and leaves behind an ink-dark silt on which a clever farmer can write his fortune with a plough. The calendar began as a patient observation of this behavior. The appearance of the brilliant star Sopdet just before dawn in summer coincided with the first murmurs of flood. The year was divided into inundation and emergence and heat, 3 seasons that carried the practical poetry of their names. Inundation was the generosity of the river when the banks blur and a fisherman can lazily pole his way across the top of yesterday's roadway. Emergence was the moment when the fields drank and showed what they had learned, straight lines of green marching like recruits. Heat was the proof and the storage and the story telling by shadowy doorways of what the earth had given into human care. Each season called forth specialized behavior, from the cutting of new irrigation channels to the sacraments of threshing. Ra presided over this annual drama in the most obvious of ways. Without his warmth, the seed would not awaken. Without his daily attention, the busiest village would go dim, because human time in Egypt followed the sun like a respectful child follows a parent. The people stood at dawn on rooftops to pray, because there is no better time to negotiate with the day than the very instant the day is born. It is not possible to speak of order and life without speaking of kingship, for in Egypt a king is not only a man who wields force, he is a linchpin. He is a living ritual. The royal titulary says so. The king is Horus, which means he sees from above and keeps the wide view. He is also the son of Ra, which means he carries the light with filial duty and not as a plaything. In formal scenes, the royal forehead is adorned with the serpent called the Uraeus, the living flame of the eye of Ra. This is more than decoration. It is a declaration that the king bears the vigilance of the sun in miniature, that his look pierces falsehood, and that his wrath, when summoned, will not quibble. From the 4th and 5th dynasties onward, the formal names of kings commonly include the phrase, son of Ra. It is a reminder in ink and stone that the throne is not a lounge chair, but an office held under bright supervision. Coronations dramatized this. The king was embraced by deities who bestowed breath and strength. He ran a course with symbols of the provinces to show that he could girdle the land with authority. He sat upon a dais whose sides were carved with lotus and papyrus intertwined, which is to say the two lands reconciled. He then faced the simple and impossible expectation of his office, which was to help the sun rise on time by behaving in ways that encouraged the world to trust him. Architecture became the public face of these promises. The square-based needle called the obelisk is a thought about light turned into permanence. The priests of Heliopolis spoke about a primeval hill called the Benben, on which the first radiance rested when the world was new. The obelisk repeats that hill in a single, elegant gesture. Its sides are inscribed with prayers and with the names of a king so that the sun may read as it moves and take pleasure. Pairs of these shafts once stood before temple gates, turning the approach to the sanctuary into a corridor of sunlight. In the 5th dynasty, several kings built sun temples in the plain near Heliopolis, with open courts and a central platform on which a squat obelisk rose. There the altar was placed in open light rather than under roof, and there was a sense that the architecture had been stripped down to its premise, which is that lawfully directed brightness is worship. People today who stand where those altars once shone may see only blocks of alabaster and lines traced in dust, but once the crash of ritual symbols and the sweetness of incense and the polished glare of the stone would have combined into a living theorem that light and law support one another. The daily life of the temples gave this theorem a rhythm. Before dawn, while the city was still in the custody of jackals and stars, priests purified themselves with natron and water and opened the shrine where the god's statue slept. There was a tenderness in this moment. The coverings were drawn aside as curtains are drawn from a bed. The small figure that represented the presence was bathed and perfumed and dressed and given breakfast. Bread and beer and fruit and slices of roast and flowers and a little fire of incense that writes its own kind of script in the air. The statue was placed upon a tiny boat whose hull gleamed with precious metal and whose prow often bore the image of a protective serpent. Then the doors were opened and the god came out to visit his courtyard. The procession around the temple is easily dismissed as procession for its own sake until one remembers the premise that a temple is a model of the world. When the god carried on his boat moves across the court, he reenacts the sun sailing across the sky, which is to say he keeps the day working. Music accompanied all of this. Sistra with their gentle rattling, flutes and drums, the chant of hymns that know by heart the names that belong to morning and midday and evening. When the god returned to his room, the doors were closed, but a small lamp of scented oil was left burning, because friendship is thoughtful even in mystery. Festivals punctuated the year with more extravagant parades of the divine. There were times when gods visited one another by river. The sacred bark was loaded on a larger boat and towed through cheering crowds as if the Nile itself had been transformed into an aisle in a great cathedral. People leaned forward from banks and balconies to catch a glimpse, not because they feared a refusal of blessings, but because in that glittering silhouette they saw the architecture of their lives condensed. At Heliopolis, the Mnevis bull was adored as a living presence of Ra. Black of hide, with a white sun mark on the brow in the ideal case, he moved through his stable courtyard, with attendants who fanned him and sang to him and fed him dishes fit for a prince. When he died, he was buried in style, as if a part of the sun had descended into the earth to remind the soil what generosity feels like. Elsewhere, the Bennu bird was invoked as a sign of fresh beginnings, a sacred heron who alights on sacred stones to announce that today will keep its appointment. Household altars echoed the state rituals in miniature. A blue faience plaque of a protective eye on a mud brick shelf, a little food and a flower stem in a jar of river water, a whispered request that when the king is strong, and the fields are green, and the sun is punctual, that the child in this house may keep his health, and that the grandmother may sleep without pain. The ethical dimension of all this is understated, which is to say, it is present in everything rather than scolded into being. Egyptians did not write a book of commandments and nail it to a door. They inscribed virtues on the walls of tombs and in the hearts of their descendants by telling stories in which the honest farmer prospers and the greedy judge is corrected by the gods, by praising officials who fed the hungry in years when the flood was late, by imagining a time after death in which each person would stand before a tribunal and say what he had not done. I have not robbed. I have not polluted the river. I have not lied in court. These negative confessions presume positive conduct. They presume that a person who respects weights and measures and cares for parents and keeps the boundary markers of fields where they have been placed will not meet daylight as a stranger. Ra plays his part here as well. The moral world has a climate, and the climate under Ra is sunny but not lax. Fraud is a cloud. Violence is an eclipse. The person who lives by Mart does not demand a medal. He asks for a clear sky in which to go about his work. In such a climate, the arts flourish because artisans delight in clarity. Relief carvers find that a sunlit wall makes crisp lines of gods and kings and gardeners and dancers. Painters teach colors to converse, a deep blue for lapis, and a fierce red for power, and a good green for life, and the blessingly monotonous brown of the water jar that always seems to appear just when thirst is heaviest. The iconography of Ra is both simple and profound. A falcon head because there is no better symbol for command of heights. A disk of sun resting above the head, circled by the serpent who is his own embodied vigilance. A staff whose forked shape stands for authority in the open country and for the shepherding of human flocks. The disk itself appears above the heads of other deities as a sign that they share in light. Hathor wears it between cow horns, a tender image that suggests the son nursed by joy. Sekhmet wears it on her lioness brow, which implies that even wrath is a servant when it serves order. The eye as a symbol stands for the power of Ra to see and to be seen, for the exchange of gazes that binds ruler to ruled in a pact that does not hide. Names of kings quietly declared their allegiance. One may read Menkar as enduring like the Ka of Ra. One may hear the name of Khafra and catch the idea of an appearance that is worthy of the Sunday. In later centuries, countless princes would carry names built from the syllables of Ra, and they would raise pylons and obelisks and processional roads to be certain that future dawns would have something handsome to wake up. At the height of this solar devotion, the courts near Heliopolis glittered with altars and sacrificial tables that did not shrink from sunlight but invited it. The royal pyramid fields to the west cast elegant triangles of shadow that appeared to pin the sun to the landscape like a golden brooch fastening a cloak. Engineers tilted passageways so that a shaft of light found its way to sacred chambers on the correct day of the year. Astronomer priests kept lists of the rising of certain star groups that served as star clocks through the night, and water clocks dripped measured drops into bowls to mark the passage of hours when stars were hidden. The country had become a web of instruments for measuring agreement between heaven and earth. None of this suggests a paradise. The myths are frankly worldly. There are years when the flood is stingy and people suffer. There are courts that need reform and villages that quarrel and deserts that advance like red-faced arguments. There are men like the eloquent peasant in a famous tale who must talk and talk to wring justice from a scribe who is slow to heed him. The point is not that light erases difficulty. The point is that light gives tools for meeting it. The presence of Ra is not a promise that we will never be thirsty. It is a promise that we will be able to find the river, and that the river, if respected, will remember its custom. The presence of Ra is not a guarantee that every king will be a saint. It is the condition that allows a wicked king to be compared with the law and found wanting. In that comparison lies survival, because revolutions are not the preferred mode of adjustment in a civilization that values continuity. Correction is. Renewal is. The said festival in which a long-ruling monarch proves his vigor again by running and by rites of rejuvenation is a kind of enacted sunlight. It says that time can be encouraged to behave like itself. For the ordinary citizen, this abundance of rite and symbol distilled into habits that were both humble and profound. The fisherman who spits a little beer into the water before casting his net is not wasting breakfast. He is acknowledging that he and the river are partners. The mother who ties a blue bead around her child's wrist is not succumbing to folly. She is reminding whatever watches that this small life is noticed and loved. The mason who on a Friday stands for a long time in the cool shade of a pylon before climbing the scaffold is not loitering. He is calibrating himself to the measure of the walls. The scribe who dips his reed and writes with the momentary seriousness of a prayer is not making an idol of his profession. He is remembering that words are deeds, that a royal tax receipt is a social promise, and that a lie in ink spoils the grain as surely as a mouse in a bin. Of course, there were stories with sharper edges gilded by this sunlight. There is a well-loved narrative of the lady of the House of Ra, Hathor, in one of her moods, dancing for her father until he laughed and the world thawed after a fit of divine melancholy. There are fearful tales of the eye returning as the lioness Sekhmet to punish human arrogance, which served as warnings that the sun can scorch as well as bless. There is the sophisticated fable in which Isis wins the secret name of Ra from his own mouth by a cleverly devised serpent bite, a story that teaches that wisdom secures authority with a patience that force cannot match. These do not contradict the gentle reign of light. They complete it. Every order that is worthy of the name carries within it the mechanisms by which it is defended and corrected and deepened. The eye can blaze when misrule spreads. Laughter can be medicine when spirits flag. Knowledge can be elevated when stubbornness threatens to make a ruin of ceremony. There is a temptation to ask whether all this is true, as if the story must square itself with the demands of a modern appetite for proof. The Egyptians would likely reply that a thing proved itself by being useful and by continuing to be beautiful. If a right keeps faith between field and farmer, then that right is true. If an image persuades the heart to prefer balance over grasping, then that image is true. If a city aligned to the sunrise teaches its people to look forward with hope each morning, then that city is an argument that truth and loveliness are cousins. And if a civilization manages to keep its feet for 3 millennia with these stories at its core, then perhaps the best question is not did this happen, but what does it protect and how does it guide us to behave? Under Ra, the sun rose in the ordinary manner and also rose in the mind. The former is physics, the latter is wisdom. So the first time matured into custom. the radiant king who had walked the gardens now governed from the sky in plain view. The people greeted him from their roofs, and from riverbanks, and from temple courtyards, each according to station, but all with the same relief that the day is once again plausible. Children ran and laughed in the warm dust. Bakers slid fragrant loaves from ovens. Boatmen leaned into their poles. Officials bent over papyrus and inked in neat columns the sums that turn grain into payroll and debt into solvency. In every act, small and great, there was the tacit understanding that the light and the law are the same substance in different costume. One wears gold, the other wears duty. Together they sustain the simple miracle of a society that knows how to wake, to work, to worship, and to rest without falling into chaos. Before anyone in the city has properly woken, when the sky is still a deep indigo and the palm fronds are black against it, there is a quiet procession through the temple's outer court. Oil lamps move like fireflies along painted walls. You would hear sandals on stone and the muffled clink of bronze, and you would smell a sweetness rising from resin that clings to the cool air. The priests have bathed. They have shaved and anointed themselves with oils that speak more of gardens than of rooms. The linen they wear is crisp and white, the color of light before it learns gold. They are the servants of the god in the most literal sense, not masters of a doctrine, but attendants who wake a king. They cross thresholds carved with stars and pass pylons shaped like mountains of dawn. At the heart of the complex, they come to a door that will open to the first time again. The morning liturgy is not a dramatized fairy tale. It is a method with memory in it. A lector priest recites the words that teach the door where it is in the story of the world. A purifying priest lifts a bowl of water and washes the lintel and the threshold so that what enters will be clean and what leaves will not lose its sanctity to dust. They break the seals and draw the bolts, and the little chamber beyond becomes visible. It is small and dark as a seed, and in that darkness the god has spent the night in the company of his breath and his names. On an altar table stands the image of Ra, not as a portrait that resembles a mortal face, but as a presence that holds his office. A falcon head that knows the horizon as well as a farmer knows his field, a disk of sun rising from a crown, a serpent coiled around it as the living reminder that vigilance keeps company with brightness. The attendants greet the image softly. They bathe it as a father might wash a child who is precious and must be made ready for public sight. They offer fresh linen and a collar of faience beads that will chime faintly against the metal of the sacred boat. They bring bread still warm from the ovens and beer, the color of amber wood and fruit, that blushes with a kind of happiness, and cuts of meat that steam in the lamplight. They light incense, and the smoke writes a swaying script that curls into the beams, as if the words of a hymn were finding a visible form. Once the god is presentable, they lift his small bark and carry him out into daylight. The boat gleams with electrum and precious wood and the 1,000 touches of craftsmen who have built a condensed horizon in miniature. The prow is adorned with a serpent that spits protection. The stern holds a standard in the shape of a fan that will stir a whisper of cool air over the deck. The procession follows a prescribed path around the courtyard, moving from east to west as the sun does, because the temple is a working model of the sky and not a hall built for speeches. Musicians sound the sistrum so that a ripple of joy keeps time with the steps. Dancers of Hathor step in unison and smile with the discipline of devotion. When the circuit is complete, the bark returns to the sanctuary, and the door is closed, and the residue of the rite is not silence, it is steadiness. The day has been helped to become itself. At Heliopolis, the devotion takes on a special flavor because the whole city is an elegy to sunrise. They call it Iunu, the pillar city, because it remembers that creation first stood upon a mound that rose from water. The priests of Ra keep a Bennu bird, a sacred heron who lives by a sacred lake and is associated with renewal. They keep them Nevis bull, a living manifestation of solar strength. He is black as a polished riverstone and carries marks that identify him to those who know what to look for, and his attendants adore him with patience and feed him dishes fit for a noble guest. When he dies, they bury him with ceremony because even a god's animal wants good company as it passes through the gate that leads to the field of peace. In the Old Kingdom, kings raised sun temples near here, with open courts and platforms crowned by monuments that catch the day. There is less roof and more sky in such places, as if the temple wanted to confess its allegiance to light without any muddling. Elsewhere, the same principle of daily care plays out with local families of gods and their own tastes. In Memphis, the great bull of Ptah is honored, and the craft guilds file past with respect for the mind that makes. In Thebes, the house of Amun has grown into a forest of columns, and the hymn writers have learned to praise the hidden wind within sunlight by naming him Amun-Ra. In provincial towns, you will find small shrines that keep a portable bark in a side room and a sacred lake behind a wall of reeds. The priests will carry the bark down to the water at appointed times, so that the god can take a little air and bless the ripples that will be drawn into ditches and poured into basins and cupfuls for cooking and washing. The god takes questions at such moments, not in a chatty way. People ask, and the porters feel the weight shift or the box sway one way or the other, and an answer is given. A yes or a no, or a not yet. It is a modest form of oracle, and it is enough, because most of life requires ordinary courage, not warm thunderbolts. The day is not only greeted, it is kept. At midday, there is a second round of offerings. Linen that has wilted in the heat is replaced. The smell of incense is renewed as a courtesy to a presence that does not tire but appreciates courtesy. A high priest recites lines from the Litany of Ra, not in a harangue but with the measured diction of someone who knows that names are tools. The sun at midday is not the same as the sun at dawn. It is unblinking and public. It shines into markets and courts and the side rooms where scribes count. The litany acknowledges this by invoking the god in titles that belong to noon. Later, toward evening, the sanctuary is settled for the night, and the god is given a final meal, and the doors are sealed, and the lamps outside the chamber burn low, and the sky prepares its own ritual of starfire. The temple sleeps, but a small watch remains awake, because the night is a battlefield in the story of the cosmos, and human vigilance is taken into account. The night watch is not romantic. It is practical magic. In a side room lit by a single lamp, a priest reads from a papyrus that lays out the correct ways to harry the serpent who waits for the bark of the sun in the deep hours. They model Apophis in wax and bind it with cord and stab it with knives that have never tasted ordinary work. They burn it, they spit on it, they stamp on it. None of this is cruelty for its own sake. It is participation in a struggle that happens with or without us. The Egyptians do not imagine that the god needs rescue, but they have a keen sense of friendship. If your great protector fights each night to rise again for you, you do not sleep through it without at least lending your breath to the spell that strengthens his arm. Above the roof, stars that have been patient all day lift their bright heads. The priests know them by decans, star groups that rise in sequence and mark the hours without recourse to a dial. The water clock drips. The wax serpent spits and writhes in the brazier. The litany continues with the slow confidence of habit. Festivals burst through this quiet discipline like a river in flood. There are days when the god leaves the inner court and travels on the broad water. The sacred boat is placed upon a larger vessel and towed by rowers who will have stories for their grandchildren. The riverbank turns into a theater, and the faces of the poor and the rich are lit by the same gleam from the gilded prow. The god visits a neighbor deity, and a reciprocal visit is promised, and the two households feast. Wine flows, harps sound, dancers wear collars of beads that throw off sunlight like a net throws silver fish. On the banks, families eat and adore and gossip and promise the children an extra sweet if they behave. Such days stitch towns together. They remind everyone that the god in the sanctuary is not a hermit but a ruler who likes to move among his people, seen and felt and heard, even if seen as a shimmer of cloth and wood and gold upon the water. Architecture never behaves like a passive backdrop in this world. A pylon is a mountain of dawn, and the shadow it throws is a cool remark about the generosity of height. A colonnade is a palm grove captured and persuaded to stand for centuries. A hyperstyle hall is a forest that will not burn because the columns are stone and the roof is a sky painted with constellations and birds. The sanctuary at the end is as small as a thought and as heavy as a duty. The way light falls through courts and deepens into shade is a lesson that the sun has day rooms and night rooms within a single building. In some temples, a beam of light on a certain day of the year will reach a niche or a statue with a precision that would shame a careless astronomer. When this happens, people do not gasp as if they had seen a trick. They nod as if an old friend had kept a promise. The economy of the temple is honest labor and not a dragon horde. Fields belong to the god in the sense that their yield is charged with holding up the structure of devotion. Millers grind, bakers bake, gardeners trim date palms and keep kitchen herbs cool and damp. Herdsmen bring cattle on the hoof for offerings and for festivals, and the priests do not waste. The food for the god becomes food for those who serve him and for those whom the god favors. Artisans are employed in ranks. Metal workers in a side court hammer out tiny fittings for the bark. Goldsmiths repair a crown that needs a brighter ribbon of metal. Weavers knot and fold linen for next week. Boat builders work on the riverbank, and their shavings smell of cedar. Scribes keep the accounts and the cycle of the year, and the records of strange events. A man who claims that a crocodile spoke to him is not dismissed out of hand, but his story is written down with care and placed in a box, along with other reports that might prove useful, or might only prove that Egyptians, like everyone else, enjoy telling tales. The household version of all this does not try to compete with grandeur. In an upstairs room with a mat on the floor and a brick niche in the wall, a mother smooths a blue glazed amulet with her thumb as she whispers a short prayer at sunrise. A fisherman pours a little beer into the river before drinking because it is courteous to share. A boy learning his letters draws a scarab and writes the word that means becoming because he likes the way the phonetics feel in his mouth. A father teaches his daughter the names of the colors on the temple painting, and he tells her that the circle above the falcon is not only a circle, it is a story about the way day behaves. The gods are present in all this as surely as they are present in the sanctuaries, and perhaps more frankly, because a home has no ambition other than to be a place where the daily contract between work and pleasure is honored. No one in Egypt thinks this state of things will continue by inertia. The Nile is kind and can be petulant. Kings can be wise and can forget themselves. Priests can be good men and can turn their hands too readily to accounting. The rites are there to remind the living what the world wants from them. The simplest entries in a hymn book do the same. Hail to you, Ra, at your rising. May the two lands rejoice when you appear. Grant that the river will meet the fields, as a mother meets a child. Grant that the scale will hang true in the market. Grant that the ears of judges will be clean. Grant that craftsmen will take pleasure in their work. This is not a petition to a distant blaze. It is a conversation with the presence that steers the day. The daily ritual and the festival splendor and the small household offerings are all acknowledgments that the world is a partnership. The sun gives light and warmth. The people keep order and gratitude. Between them stands Mart, the feather that does not bend when pressed by fair weight. In Heliopolis, there is a memory older than speech that the first light touched a stone shaped like the point of an obelisk and stayed there as if a guest had found a welcome. Every morning, when the temple doors open and the incense rises and the bark moves with careful pride and the hymns roll through the court, the memory is not only remembered, it is reenacted and renewed. The Egyptians do not pretend that this will suffice for all times, but they trust that it will suffice for today, and they will do it again tomorrow, and the next day, until they are gone, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren do it in their stead. That is the secret at the heart of worship. Not the grand idea that a God is almighty, for that is obvious, but the practical idea that human beings can be dependable in small ways that add up to dignity. There is a moment in the long life of the sun when power grows heavy with age, and wisdom begins to taste of weariness. The Egyptians told this with a frankness that feels like respect. Ra had ruled from the first hill that rose out of the waters of Nun. He had walked in gardens with the Ennead about him, and the world had been young and trusting. But time works on gods as surely as it works on river stones, not to break them but to alter the way they shine. In the tale called The Book of the Heavenly Cow, which priests copied onto the walls of royal tombs and onto costly coffins, the people looked at their bright sovereign and whispered that his bones were old. They talked in corners. They plotted to test him. There was nothing boyish in this treachery. It was the human habit of impatience finding a mythic voice. Ra heard, because the sun has never been poor at listening. He summoned a council in the darkness beside creation, for serious conversations often prefer night. Nun, the primeval sea, rose in that audience, as if an old lake had stirred. Shu and Tefnut stood by as the space and the moisture that allow all debates to breathe. The matter was simple. The cattle of Ra had forgotten themselves. When a king who loves order faces rebellion, he does not begin by thundering. He consults. None advised a reminder. "Send forth your eye," he said, "and let the world remember who it is that lifts the light." The eye of Ra is not merely a jewel. It is a living force that turns the will of the sun into action. In one aspect, she is the lady of music and gladness. In another, she is a lioness with a breath that can burn steppe grass to ash. Ra sent the eye as a warning made visible. She descended among humankind, and the warning became a lesson that no one who survived would forget. The story of that punishment belongs to the next part of this chapter, where we will watch how wrath becomes a teacher and how mercy finds its way back into a heart that has known rage. For the moment, it is enough to know that the eye did what she had been born to do. She showed that order is not a polite suggestion. When the dust settled and the cries ceased, Ra looked upon the earth and felt no triumph. He felt a fatigue that was older than policy. The one who feeds the world sometimes grows thin with feeding. The Book of the Heavenly Cow lets us hear him say that his bones pain him and that he is tired of the striking of men. He resolves that the time has come to unfasten himself from the land and to make his throne in the sky. It is not an abdication. It is a change of office. To remain on earth, face to face with easy gratitude and sudden ingratitude, is to be tugged at by 1,000 hands. To govern from the arc of the heavens is to give light to all without being daily bruised by their closeness. He summons the sky goddess Nut, who is already the vault of gold-flecked night, and he bids her take a new shape. She becomes the great celestial cow whose back can bear a kingdom. It is a beautiful and unsettling image. Her legs are the pillars of the 4 quarters. Her belly is the dome that will hold the stars. Her neck arches like a river that has learned how to sing. Ra climbs upon her back. Gods place themselves about her as supports, and in some carvings you will see small figures of the god of infinity squatting beneath her hooves with upraised hands to show that eternity happily lifts the heavens. The air god Shu braces her belly from below, doing forever what he did once at the beginning when he pushed sky from earth, so that living things would have a room to inhabit. Standards rise, heralds raise voices. The world looks up and witnesses the most consequential departure in the long memory of Egypt. It is not a flight in panic, it is a ceremony. The one who first stood on the primordial hill steps aboard the living sky and makes his royal progress outward until the day itself becomes his palace. As Ra ascends, he does the work of a lawgiver who refuses to leave confusion in his wake. He appoints Thoth to speak for him in matters of time and right. The moon, therefore, becomes not a lesser sun but a measured companion in the night, a magistrate who keeps the hours honest when the day is elsewhere. He sets stars in the body of Nut, like oil lamps in a sanctuary, thousands upon thousands of secrets that will carry messages to those who take the trouble to learn their script. In the afterlife books carved in royal tombs, you can still read sequences of star groups called decans that rise in turn to mark the hours of the night. He provides a map for the journey that all must take when lungs no longer answer and the heart is weighed against the feather of truth. There are fields of reeds that shimmer like a river at dawn, and there are canals that mirror the Nile, because the Egyptian imagination believed that reward looks like a perfected version of work rather than an escape from work. Ra does not neglect the other side of the horizon. He lays out the passages and caverns of the unseen realm, the places through which his boat must pass after sunset when he becomes an aged atom, and sails in the company of protectors to face the serpent who would swallow light. In doing this, he takes the terror from the night and replaces it with procedure. Even darkness can be negotiated when it is given a chart. The Book of the Heavenly Cow remembers one more adjustment that speaks to the new distance between heaven and village. Kingship is made a human office with a divine shadow. When Ra lived on earth as an elderly sovereign, he was the direct master. Now he appoints the king as his champion and heir. The title Son of Ra that appears so often in the cartouches of the early dynasties is not mere affection. It is a reminder that the light has delegated, but not departed. The human monarch becomes the visible officer of Ma'at on the ground. He will measure fields after flood. He will hear pleas from the hungry. He will build and repair temples that keep the heavenly routines synchronized with the clocks of the earth. In festival and in daily rite, he will present Ma'at to his father the sun and receive from him breath and strength, which in plain language means that order is a loop of mutual obligation rather than a one-way gift that can be squandered. From the day of the ascent onward, Egypt understands that the king is not a substitute for the sun, but a steward who stands in sunlight. The ascent affects the shape of temples because architecture in Egypt is the conscience of theology. Pylons take the form of twin mountains between which the sun rises. Obelisks become the petrified memory of the first mound that received the dawn. Roofs are painted with Nut's starry body, so that those who serve in the inner rooms never forget the ceiling above all ceilings. On some temple walls, the scene of the celestial cow is carved with a mixture of tenderness and awe. The great creature strides with careful steps, while small figures lift her and steadies weight beneath her hooves. Ra sits upon her back in a pavilion with side walls of woven reeds and a canopy that gleams. The representation is at once homely and incomprehensible, a household gesture at the scale of eternity. In later centuries, when scribes copied the Book of the Heavenly Cow into burial papyri, they included recipes for pacifying forces that rattle the order of the night and for safeguarding the heart of the deceased against fear. The book is at once a drama and a manual. The withdrawal of Ra from the fields to the firmament does not impoverish the earth. It clarifies the chain of care. Festivals of intoxication, remember, the day wrath was calmed by cunning. Priests stand on roofs in the last purpling of evening and recite litanies that call the god by names suited to the dusk. Guardians of night sit in small stone rooms with a single lamp and read spells that strengthen the prow of the bark against the biting serpent. Farmers make their first cuts in fields that have drunk the flood and give thanks to the light with a good sense of people who know they are not alone. A mother tells her child the story of the cow with stars on her belly, and the God who climbed to his rest, and the child sleeps with fewer alarms, because even the great changes in the world have been given a kind explanation. What the myth accomplishes is startlingly practical. It explains why the gods no longer walk visibly in streets, and yet insists that they still govern. It explains why the sky looks like a bowing animal with constellations upon its hide. It invites the community to grow up without growing faithless. It offers an account of why kingship bears a divine title without pretending that a mortal can keep the sun in his pocket. It naturalizes the idea that the world is divided into day and night, life and afterlife, flood and drought, celebration and caution, all linked by a steady intelligence that does not abandon its commitments. The drama of the celestial cow, for all its marvel, is a lesson in delegation. Ra learns to be present by being spacious rather than near. The people learn to be loyal by being responsible rather than dependent. There is a passage in the Heavenly Cow story in which Ra commands that the world be ornamented in ways that will remind the living to behave. He orders fires to be set in the form of serpents along the edges of the night so that hostile powers will be discouraged. He installs guardians who will question the dead with courteous severity. He places his own image in the smallest amulet so that a person who is frightened can hold a piece of courage between finger and thumb. In these gestures, the sun god becomes not a monarch who refuses to be troubled, but a parent who is learning how to let the house run under rules that make sense, even when he is no longer in the next room. The cow, with her vast back and patient step, is the cosmos learning how to carry itself. From that day, the people looked upward with a fuller understanding. The dawn is the child of a pact. The sun rises because the god has chosen to ride the sky rather than the street, and because the community has chosen to participate in the rituals that keep that ride untroubled. The evening is not the edge of fear, but the beginning of a known journey through which a companionable moon and disciplined stars will lead the way. The night has a map, the fields have a cadence, kings have a mandate, priests have work that is more than show. Ordinary people have stories that teach them to mend nets and settle debts, and speak clearly in market and court because there is a feather somewhere that is listening. The image of Ra on the celestial cow remains one of the loveliest in the Egyptian treasury of thought. It is unashamedly strange, and at the same time wonderfully domestic. The pillars beneath her hooves are personifications of time itself holding up a living roof. The god is seated in a small shrine on her back, like a grandfather taking the air in a garden pavilion. The world is saved from the exhaustion of intimacy by a new kind of love that prefers steadiness to constant company. The sun has not gone away. He has learned to be everywhere at once, without having to be in any single place for long. That is what kings do when they become truly royal. They occupy a role rather than a room. When mortals first murmured against their lord, the answer that came from the heart of the sun was not a speech. It was an eye. The eye of Ra is a power that has the shape of a goddess and the purpose of a verdict. In her mildest mood, she is Hathor, a lady of music and joy whose laugh sounds like water over pebbles. In her fierce aspect, she is Sekhmet, the powerful one, whose breath is the hot wind before a sandstorm and whose glance can cure or wither. The Book of the Heavenly Cow tells how Ra sent his eye to punish the plotting of mankind. The eye went down among the rebels and changed her face to the lioness whose coat gleams like copper in the sunday. Then came a hunting through the two lands that no one forgot. Fields that had been safe for plows became fields of reaping. Villages that were used to the tidy logic of markets and festivals learned that the sun can burn as well as bless. Sekhmet did not rage as a mad creature rages. She was doing the office for which she had been called. The gentleness of Hathor had become a straight line of justice as clean as a blade. Egyptians who carve and paint gods do not hide from severity. On temple walls, the lioness advances with the sun disk on her brow and the serpent above it, which declares that the vigilant eye is crowned with living flame. She is called Mistress of Dread and Lady of Flame, and one before whom evil trembles. Doctors who learned their craft from the gods called themselves priests of Sekhmet because they knew that the same fire that consumes can cauterize a wound, and that the same fierce focus that terrifies a wrongdoer can also fix a fever with unwavering attention. Her priests made offerings not to inflame her, but to steady her. They recited litanies for the first days of the year, when spirits are restless, and the old season has not yet learned to hand the field to the new. They recorded prescriptions that treat a bite and a burn and a grief. In their shrines, lions watch from pedestals with a seriousness that is somehow reassuring. The message is plain. The world is kept by a power that takes trouble seriously. The story says that the slaughter went on until the land could bear no more. Ra looked and was not pleased by the neatness of revenge. He resolved to save the humans who had not forgotten themselves and to spare the world the habit of constant blood. The cunning that belongs to kingship met the appetite of a goddess in a device that blends mercy with craft. Ra ordered servants to brew beer in a quantity that would have filled a canal and to tint it with red ochre until it looked like a field of blood in the light of evening. Some traditions say 7,000 jars were poured out upon the ground in a low place where Sekhmet would come hunting at dawn. Others say that the drink ran in rills and pools across the sand, as if the desert itself had opened a vein. When the lioness came upon the gleam, she lowered her great head and drank. She was thirsty from rage. She drank again. The beer laughed in her belly and warmed her heart and loosened her jaw from the clench of judgment. The sun rose. Her eyes softened. The fire that had filled the courtyards and hill tracks grew thoughtful. By afternoon, the huntress had become Hathor again, swaying with delight and smiling at songs. In this way, wrath turned into celebration without denying its cause, for the Egyptians rarely pretend that the dangerous can be wished away. They prefer to teach the dangerous to dance. Ritual remembers this kindness with a festival that belongs to joy and to caution at once. At Dendera, where Hathor is beloved as the lady of love and music and good cheer, priests kept a feast of intoxication to commemorate the night when beer dyed red saved the world from being too severely mended. Men and women drank to the edge of forgetfulness and then laughed at the edge and came back. They sang hymns that praise the state of a heart made light and the cleverness of a god who knows that a lesson must not be the last word. Instruments shook and rang. Dancers in collars that sparkled like shallow water stepped with the neat grace of people who know they are supervised by benevolence. The lesson lives in the liturgy. Anger may be holy, mercy must be holier. Order must not starve compassion. The sun never refuses to rise again. Sekhmet remained in the land not as a threat but as a necessary presence. The boundary stones of plague and war are not moved by flutes and garlands alone. In the reign of Amenhotep III, whose builders had an appetite for grandeur, hundreds of statues of the lioness were set up in courts and halls. Some stood as silent sentinels in the precincts of the great temple of Ammon at Karnak. Others guarded the mortuary complex on the west bank where the king wished to rest among dignified company. There is a scholarly explanation that a surge of these images reflects a wish to lay a net of healing across the years. There had been sickness in the land. There had been worries that disorder might rise again. The king answered by multiplying the physical presence of a goddess who punishes epidemics and watches physicians. In these statues, Sekhmet holds an ankh in one hand and a scepter in the other, which is to say life and authority in balance. The stone is dark and dense. The line of the jaw is not cruel but alert. The message is that the land is being watched by a power that does not blink. The Eye of Ra has many names and many journeys. In some tales, she wanders to the south and must be coaxed home by Thoth with jokes and promises and letters of invitation. In others, she sulks in the desert, and the jackals listen to her breathing at night. In still others, she is Bastet, the cat who lounges on the warm threshold of the house, and then, in an instant, becomes a blur of purpose that saves a child from a snake. All these tales belong to the same grammar. The light can go too far and must be gentled. The gentling is not humiliation. It is a return to harmony. When the eye comes home, she takes her place on the brow of the sun and the uraeus rises, and men and women who wear small amulets of that serpent at their necks feel watched by a courage that does not scorch. From the day when the red beer stained the sand, the festivals of Hathor and the pacifications of Sekhmet settled into the rhythm of the year. New Year rites at Karnak and elsewhere included recitations that cool the goddess. Priests poured water that had slept overnight in jars and called it fresh as the Nile when it first kisses the fields. They burned incense that smells like green wood and rain. Doctors wrote charms that begin with prayers to the powerful one to turn her face toward healing. Women preparing to give birth asked Bastet to hold them with a softness that would not drop them. Soldiers who went to the frontier stopped at a lioness chapel and promised to behave themselves. The myths made of wrath and mercy a pair of reins that guide the chariot of the state. The Egyptians thought deeply about what this says of the Sunday. A god that never punishes is a god that does not care. A god that never forgives is a tyrant who will destroy his own house. The eye teaches the balance. The same gaze that searches out a liar in court is the gaze that watches over a shepherd on a cold night. The same heat that cracks clay so a pot can be fired is the heat that hardens the ink on a treaty. The tale of Sekhmet's rampage is not an episode of celestial temper. It is the revelation that light has two sides, and that wisdom keeps both in employment without allowing either to run the office alone. In the morning, Ra accepts Ma'at from the hands of priests and returns it to the country as a climate of fairness. In the evening, he descends toward the river of the underworld, where his strength will be needed, and where a lioness stands at the prow of the bark, with a spear ready in her hand. The same goddess who learned to drink and laugh stands guard while the world sleeps. So the story of the punishment and the beer does not end with a sigh of relief. It ends with a new skill. Kings are reminded that firmness without humor is brittle, and that mercy without memory is weak. Priests are reminded that their music is not entertainment, but a tool that can coax rage back into service. The people are reminded that they are loved severely. The lioness returns to her shrine with flowers at her feet and bandages in her basket, and the doctors who serve her go about their rounds with a confidence that has room for kindness. The next time the wind rises hot from the south, and a caravan brings bad news, the city does not panic. It makes offerings. It tells the story of the ochre beer. It looks to the image of the goddess and sees not a threat, but a promise that force and joy will keep the day upright. At first light, the world holds its breath as if someone somewhere has drawn a curtain made of rose and saffron and is waiting for the right moment to lift it. In that hush, the eastern horizon begins to glow with a certainty that has comforted farmers and kings and poets for as long as stones remember. This is the hour when Ra takes his place upon the morning boat and begins the journey that is not only a journey, but a proof. He does not scramble into a vessel like a harried traveler. He enters a crafted presence called the Manjet, the boat of morning, a divine craft whose lines are both elegant and purposeful. The prow is keen, shaped to part the waters of the sky as a reed canoe parts a canal. The stern rises in a deliberate flourish. A small shrine stands amidships like a pavilion within which the form of the god gleams, sometimes as a scarab that radiates becoming, sometimes as a falcon whose eye keeps company with distances, and always as the one whose light turns objects into companions. The heavens at dawn are not empty blue. They are a river of brightness given a current by the will of the Sunday. The Egyptians loved this analogy and drew the firmament as water scored with ripples, for they knew that the Nile had taught the sky how to move. The crew of the Manjet is a court in miniature. At the prow stands Mart, not in statuesque stiffness, but with the alert serenity of one who knows that proportion is the only decorum that matters. Beside the shrine are Sia and Hu, perception and authoritative speech, for knowledge and the command that knowledge issues are never far from the seat of power. Near them comes Heka, magic understood not as trickery, but as the energy that fuses intention to reality. A helmsman holds the steering oar in both hands and reads the lanes of radiance with the skill of a pilot who has made this passage since the first time. The deck receives other attendants as the myths require. Thoth is often there in the early hours, since timekeeping is his joy, and since the sun should never arrive late to its own appointment. In some scenes, 2 guardians in feathered crowns stand alert, and in others a lion-headed sentinel stares past the bow as if daring mischief to try its luck by daylight. The company is not fixed because the Egyptians love to remember that one truth can be told by many casts. The day voyage has its own geography. The eastern horizon is a gate notched between 2 golden hills, a sign the scribes wrote as a sun disk cradled between twin mountains and called Akhet. Through that gate the god comes forth, an infant in the arms of the morning. It is a charming and rigorous idea. The sky goddess Nut is drawn with her star-strewn body arched from east to west, and the sun is said to arise from her loins at dawn and to pass along her belly until he sets at her mouth. It is an image that makes some modern readers blush while it makes Egyptians nod with satisfaction, because birth is the most obvious metaphor for renewal. At sunrise, the god is Khepri, the scarab. The beetle that rolls a ball of dung across the ground became a living emblem of the cosmic truth that life hides itself within husks and emerges when the time is right. Priests wore small scarab seals at the throat, not because beetles are fashionable, but because remembrance and rebirth are practical virtues for people who wish to live as long as possible in a world that keeps changing its costume. As the boat clears the gate and the low light becomes a stride rather than a promise, Ra takes a form fit for command. He is the falcon with the sun on his brow, or he is a human figure with the head of that vigilant bird, or he is simply the blazing disk itself encircled by a serpent that is the visible signature of his alertness. The disk appears above other gods as well, resting between the cow horns of Hathor or upon the lion head of Sekhmet. But at noon, it is his proper crown. The hour of ascent is busy. The boat must thread the lanes that lie between the fields of cloud and the chalky heights of the upper air. The hours of the day are personified as goddesses who come forward in sequence to bear the bark along, each with her own character and her own responsibilities. Baboons greet the rising sun with lifted hands from cliff faces and temple roofs. These apes are not comic relief. They are emblems of holy surprise, creatures who remember to be astonished at the exact same time every morning, which is a discipline many philosophers fail to acquire. Below, the land answers. The Nile glints like a polished blade as water carriers shoulder their jars. Irrigation workers open channels and watch the first eager streams tumble into fields where the soil still smells of last night. In gardens behind houses, the sycamore of the east casts a veined shade and plays host to a goddess who leans from the trunk to offer cool water to those who happen to dream beneath her. Far to the west, the storied necropolis sits with patience, its faces turned toward the river and the dawn. Even in Tumart, the dayboat is drawn with care, for the dead wish to be reassured that the world outside their doors is proceeding with proper seriousness. When the god is at the summit of the sky, he embodies the full strength of the day. This is the hour of Ra in undisguised authority. The litany of the sun confers upon him many names appropriate to this moment, not because one cannot remember who he is, but because the middle of the day displays so many useful virtues at once that a single address would be rude. He is the light that judges without favoritism. He is the warmth that persuades seeds to break their shells. He is the gaze that unsettles liars and steadies honest men. The language of forms is not idle poetry. It is a toolkit. When the god is Khepri, he reminds the city that beginnings are labor. When he is Ra-Harakti, Horus of the two horizons, he is the covenant between east and west made visible. When he is Atum in the late afternoon, he is the completeness that no longer needs to hurry. Temples encode these phases with an ingenuity that still startles careful visitors. A chapel opens to the sunrise, so that a beam enters on a certain day to strike the far wall with a rectangle of glory. A court is planned so that shade and brightness trade places as the hours pass, teaching a lesson that can be learned only by watching. A sanctuary roof has stars picked out in blue and gold, even though the room is kept dim by day. A quiet reminder that the ceiling above every ceiling is the night which will claim the god in due course and ask him to work again for our sake. The manjet carries rules, along with radiance. The course is lawful. The crew adheres to ceremony. The prow kisses the air at the appointed moments in the appointed places. When the boat reaches the zenith, the god accepts offerings in the form of praise and in the form of simple competence on earth. A scribe who balances his accounts contributes to the forward motion. A magistrate who hears the small case with the same attention he gives to the large case keeps the oar true. A bricklayer whose wall is plumb helps the boat to avoid a list. The Egyptians were not embarrassed by this analogy. They believed that the smallest decent act has a cosmological echo. This is why a market inspector who checks the weights of pepper and cumin is found painted near a procession of priests. The placement says that piety without fairness is tedious, and fairness without piety is a muscle without a skeleton. The day voyage also keeps company with winds. The Egyptians named and watched them as carefully as we watch the faces of those we love. A soft breath from the north that filled the sails was a blessing, for it pushed boats upriver while the current took them down, a convenient arrangement that persuaded many to think kindly of Providence. In sky scenes, the sail of the solar boat sometimes bellies with a breeze you can almost hear. At other times, the oars are out, and the deck crew bends to work. It is a subtle point, and a true one. Even gods prefer help to idleness. The hours lend their shoulders. The lesser deities lend their attention. The world lends its gratitude. The journey to noon and beyond is a shared effort, and in that sharing human work acquires a certain luster that is not entirely metaphor. As afternoon lengthens, the imagery begins to tilt toward rest without suggesting weakness. Ra takes again the shape of a Tum, the complete one. His face is older. His staff is not a crutch, but an emblem of satisfaction. The light grows warmer, the sort of light that turns walls to honey and convinces birds to consider bedtime. The boat inclines subtly toward the west, and the crew prepares for the handover that evening requires. The gate of the western horizon is a mirror of the eastern gate. The sign is again the sun between twin hills, but the emotional temperature is not the same. Morning is expectancy. Evening is trust. The necropolis faces this gate with a confidence carved in stone. For the inhabitants believe that the god will do at night what he has done every night since the world began, and that in the morning he will return with news that terror has once again been made to behave. Between these gates, the day accomplishes a curriculum. Objects become visible, then distinct, then beautiful, then shadowed. People move from promise to action, to appraisal, to memory. Fields drink, then grow, then rest. Courts open, rule, and adjourn. The royal administration stirs, makes its decrees, and sets its seals. Children run and then yawn. In every part of this, the presence of the sun is implicated, and in every part of this, the boat in the sky is a reminder that the mundane is the outer surface of a sacred procession. The Egyptians did not separate their thought into tidy boxes, marked holy and ordinary. They preferred to say that the ordinary is the place where holiness learns good manners. When the prow finally noses toward the western ridge, the god has done what he set out to do. He has brought clarity and warmth and judgment and energy in sufficient quantities to keep the two lands joined in civility. He has accepted the offerings of song and incense, and the offerings of well-dug channels and accurate receipts. He has kept the course without drifting, and he has allowed the company of powers on deck to contribute according to their nature. The river below glows red, and then purple, and then the improbable blue of remembered water. The last flares of light burn on the edges of obelisks and on the tips of palm fronds, and then the world settles into a comfortable astonishment at the fact that day has once again been completed for everyone at once. The boat shifts with a quiet change of gear. The morning craft is not suited to the tunnels and caverns that wait beyond the hills of the west. Another vessel will be required, another set of skills, another presence beside the shrine. The sky holds its last translucent breath, as if the roof of the world were thinking. The god enters the gate, and the first stars solve themselves from the deepening blue. The story of the night is about to begin, and with it the battle that must be fought for every tomorrow that wishes to exist. Evening is not an ending in Egypt. It is a doorway with watchmen on either side. The sun comes to the western hills, and the world does not feel abandoned. It feels like a house that is being tucked in. The boat of the day glides toward the horizon, and the god prepares himself for the other half of kingship, the work that must be done out of sight, so that the visible gesture in the morning can look effortless. The vessel changes for the passage to come. The manjet is retired with ceremony, and the Mesektet is brought forward, long and sure as a thought that has learned the path through a difficult book. The form of the sun shifts too, as a man changes garments when going from court to workshop. He is no longer the hawk-headed sovereign crowned in blinding gold. He becomes the ram-headed lord of renewal, a form that the Egyptians loved because the ram was vigor and seed and patient strength. In art, the face is serene and grave, and the horns curl like the springs of a great machine. The god is older now, old in the way of a master who knows every tool by its proper name and who is never flustered by darkness. He steps aboard, and the prow turns toward the gate in the western ridge, and the air seems to gather itself as if it meant to become water. That gate is guarded by the double lion called Acre, a creature who looks two ways at once, into the land of the living and into the realm that waits beyond. He is not a threat to the bark. He is a porter who never sleeps. The sign of his presence is found in tombs and on lintels and on the sides of coffins, a reminder that the passages between states are safer when a good animal watches them. The boat slides past, and the first hour of the night begins. The texts that describe the journey speak with the authority of pilots. There is the book of what is in the underworld, which scribes call the Amduat. And there is the book of gates, and there is the book of caverns, and there are other collections of scenes and spells that the royal dead loved to have painted on their walls. They are not fiction to the Egyptians. They are maps and procedures. They tell who stands at each bend in the river of night, and what must be said to them, and which knots must be tied to quell a storm or to bind a serpent, and how to recognize the moment when the soul of the sun and the soul of the Lord of the West will meet to exchange strength. Hour by hour, the river of night unwinds. In the early reaches, the Mesektet moves across pure waters, populated by helpful deities who love the order of things. The hours are personified as gracious women who take up the tow rope and sing as they pull. Sia, the divine intelligence, and Hu, the word that commands, remain beside the shrine, because even a god traveling at night requires knowledge and speech. The goddess Maat comes aboard as a small figure placed directly before the shrine of the sun, an image of the truth the bark carries with it, so that whatever approaches will see that the god does not enter the dark without his own promise in view. Thoth attends with his palette because time must be measured even in blindness. Circuit the scorpion goddess lurks near the beam because the night has menaces that require her sting. The kings of old stand in ranks on the banks of the dark river. They call out blessings and receive breath in return, a gust of life that keeps their names clear in the ears of their descendants. Soon the river thins and the banks close in, for the boat enters the realm of Sokar, the falcon lord of silence who rules a desert of burial mounds and secret workshops. Here the water gives way to sand, and the bark must be carried on its own back like a boat hoisted on rollers. Artists knew this and drew the hull transformed into a serpent so that the craft could glide through the grit and over the low hills of the necropolis without taking on wounds. This region is called Rosatau by some, a place where the mouths of caverns open at the feet of pyramids and where the dead learn the manners of eternity. Masks hang on pegs and coffers are latched, and tools are set aside because the living have finished their part, and the god must do the rest. The silence is not empty. It hums with the work of restoration. There is a lake of fire in these scenes, but it is not a vulgar threat to the innocent. It is a weapon that flares against those who would gnaw at the edges of the divine order. Serpents whose breath is flame do the work of warding. They do not scorch the righteous. They burn only what would hurt the day. In the same stretch, there are 4 great baboons who hail the god in the darkness with hands upraised as they do in the morning. The Egyptians were never embarrassed to suggest that devotion has a rhythm that can be learned by animals. There are fields in the night as well, small and irrigated, where justified spirits draw water and tend grain so that the next sunrise will smell of bread and work. The currents are purposeful. They do not drift. The helmsman keeps the prow aligned with an invisible channel. In the middle watch comes the heart of the night. The divine boat enters the chamber where Osiris reigns upon a throne of quiet power, and the 2 greatest stories in Egypt knit themselves together. The sun is the moving engine of this world, and the Lord of the West is the fixed judge of the next. They embrace without words. In the iconography, the ram-headed soul of Ra approaches the throne and gives light and breath to Osiris, and Osiris in turn gives stability and regeneration to Ra. The result of this kiss is a compound spirit called Ra-Osiris, an intelligence that is both movement and rootedness. The blessed dead who dwell in that hall are warmed by the visit and receive a portion of the strength that will turn into dawn. In the better tombs, this moment is painted with a lushness that has not faded even now. Green shoots rise from the body of Osiris to show that death is not barren. The bar-bird of the sun flutters with wide wings above the prow, its human head crowned by the disk that hints at morning. No sooner is the exchange complete than the enemy reveals himself. The coiled serpent called Apophis, or Apep, lurks in the caverns just beyond the court of Osiris. He is not a rival god. He is a principle given a mouth. He is the appetite that wants to swallow light and unmake creation by pulling it down into a wet and heavy silence. He lies in wait at the 7th or the 8th hour, depending on which book you read. He surrounds the boat with his enormous length like a noose that wishes to forget it was a rope. The boat is snagged. The crew feels the drag, as if the current had turned backwards. It is at this juncture that the most unlikely of allies becomes the champion of daylight. Set, the god of the desert and of turbulent strength, steps to the rail and harpoons the serpent with a shout that could be heard in Thebes if ears were made for that kind of sound. The other gods leap to their parts. Isis and Neith and Circuit spit spells that make bonds of stubborn fiber. Mehen, the great protective serpent of the sun, loops himself around the shrine so that the heart of the bark is beyond the reach of sudden poison. The crew hacks at knots of darkness with knives that have been blessed with the words that first taught iron to be sharp. The priests on earth are not idle at this hour. In their little rooms they spit and stamp and burn wax images and recite against Apophis with the comfortable fury of men who have inherited a family duty. Seen from the walls of a royal tomb, it is the best kind of scene, crowded and legible, a ballet of spears and cords and incantations that ends, the only way it can end, with the coils slack and the way open. Past the ambush, the river widens again, and the night becomes generous. The bark passes by the field of offerings and the field of reeds, those echoes of the Nile Valley that reward the justified with endless harvest and with canals that gleam like polished bronze. Spirits there stand as tall as they please, and their limbs do not ache. They plough with adzes made for joy instead of necessity. They hail the god as he passes, and their voices sound like wind through papyrus. The bark halts so that blessings may be exchanged. The dead receive light that keeps their households bright in the memory of the living. The god receives praise, which is the kind of food that never weighs him down. Farther along there are caverns full of the enemies of the god who are held with hooks and stakes and nets, a discouraging sight for those who consider treachery a profitable enterprise. These punishments are not spite, they are engineering. They make sure that the same trouble does not have to be cured from scratch every night. As the 11th hour draws on, the god begins to make himself new. The texts show the corpse of the sun as a long shape that is reassembled by goddesses who are midwives of mornings. Spells are spoken over limbs and over the spine and over the secret places of breath. The scarab Khepri appears and pushes the solar disk through the tight passages of the eastern rocks like a wise beetle who has chosen a fortunate moment to roll. The crew becomes merry with discipline, the particular cheer of sailors who see a familiar lighthouse after long work. Breath gathers in the chest of the god, and the red gold starts in his cheeks. The ram-headed soul gives way to the infant power that will soon be a hawk again. It is not rebirth as a fairy tale. It is maintenance of a system by those who love it. At the 12th hour, the boat enters the last tunnel, a long passage described by scribes as the womb of the sky goddess Nut. She is shown swallowing the sun in the evening and giving birth to him at dawn. A fact that pleased Egyptians of every station because it joined the cosmos to the most intimate of human experiences with complete simplicity. The double lionacre appears again, now as the guardian of the eastern gate. The muscles in the backs of the gods on the tow rope shift and shine. Shu raises his hands beneath the vault as he did at the very start. There is a trembling in the blue as if a great creature had stretched in sleep. Then the disk lifts from the mouth of the cave. First a line of crimson, then a shot of bright copper. Then the round face of day, newborn and awake, and ready to begin again. The crew has done its duty. The decans fade as the stars politely withdraw. The blessed dead nod and go back to their tasks in the fields that never exhaust themselves. The bark of night becomes the boat of morning without a fuss, as a craftsman sets down one chisel and takes up another. This is why the Egyptians could love the night without fearing it. They had learned its itinerary. They trusted the company aboard the boat. They knew that even the disorderly Set could be persuaded to throw his strength on the side of the light when the contract of the world required it. They understood that Osiris waits in the center of the dark like a rooted tree that shares its water with a running stream. They believed that the terrible serpent could be bound as often as necessary if everyone did his part, from the helmsman who keeps a steady hand to the priest, with the water clock counting the hours to the family that greets the sunrise from a flat roof with a simple breakfast and a word of thanks. The storytelling is lavish, but the lesson is not. It is this: the day is won at night. The morning is earned by skill and by friendship. The sun that rises is not a trick of physics. It is a covenant kept. When Egyptians spoke of the Eye of Ra, they did not mean a jewel set in a crown, although there is a serpent of gold that curls upon royal brows and spits light like a warning. They meant a living will that can step into the world as a goddess and accomplish what the sun decides. The eye is a title and a mission. It is the forward glance of the day when it must act. At times the eye is gentle and pours sweetness like milk. At times the eye is a blade that cuts deceit from the fabric of society. The myths name her again and again because no single face can carry so much labor. Hathor, Sekhmet, and Bastet are the most beloved forms of this brightness. Each has her own city, her own music, her own favored instruments and priests, yet all are expressions of one fierce promise. The world will be fed and defended and delighted by the light, and the light will not apologize for being strong. Begin with Hathor, whose name means the house of Horus, which is another way of saying she is a refuge for royal power and a room in which joy learns to dance. In art, she can appear as a cow whose coat shines like cream warmed by morning, or as a woman with the ears of that sacred animal, or as a queen who wears on her head the disk of the sun resting between curving horns. She holds the sistrum, a rattle whose sound lives somewhere between metal and rain, and a minat necklace that swings against the palm like a pulse you can hear. The Egyptians love to call her the Golden One, and the Lady of Jubilation, and the Mistress of Turquoise, the last, because her shrines watched over the Sinai mines, where blue-green stone was coaxed from the ribs of mountains and carried home along desert tracks in baskets and song. At Dendera, her temple has a roof where the zodiac learned Egyptian, and a hypostyle hall where capitals are carved as her face, serene and watchful, 1,000 times repeated, so that the room becomes a chorus of welcome. She pours drink for the weary and laughter for the worried. She also carries the eye within her brow and reminds the careless that delight has a spine. Sekhmet wears no disguise. She is a lioness with the disk of the sun blazing above her head and a cobra raised in salute. If Hathor is the feast, Sekhmet is the rule that says, "You must not steal the bread." Physicians honored her because she knew both the bite of fever and the calm hand that cools it. Her titles do not mince words. Lady of Flame, Mistress of Dread, one before whom evil trembles. She was loved with a gravity that does not blink. In the age of Amenhotep III, a king who liked his monuments to speak in a deep voice, hundreds of statues of the lioness were set up in courts and colonnades. Some scholars say this surge was a net of protection against years of sickness. Others add that the king wished the land to feel defended by stone. Walk among those dark figures where they survive, and you sense what the Egyptians wanted to say. There is a power in the world that despises cruelty and can burn it out like dry rot. There is also a power that can stitch a wound and watch over the convalescent with eyes that do not wander. Priests of Sekhmet kept lists of ritual days that required cooling her temper. They poured water that had slept through the night and called it fresh as new lilies. They recited words that anchor a goddess to mercy without diminishing her edge. Bastet is the smile on the threshold at noon. She is the cat whose shoulder leans into the sunlight without apology. In the delta city of Bubastis, her festival made the river laugh. Herodotus, who noticed everything and was pleased by most of it, says that boats crowded with men and women drifted downstream with music and jokes for bystanders, and that the city welcomed them with food and garlands and generous cups. In houses dedicated to her cult, archaeologists have found the small coffins of mummified cats laid with as much ceremony as any noble burial. A domestic piety that says affection is not trivial. Bastet guards children and households, and the quiet happiness that makes a family love the place where it eats and sleeps. Yet she too is the eye. The gentle paw becomes a flash of claws when a snake troubles the doorway. And a woman who wears a small image of Bastet at her throat feels not only pretty, but watched over by a courage that does not roar. These three together tell us what the Egyptians believed about the uses of light. Delight is not an indulgence, it is a policy. Music and wine and the clatter of the sistrum are not excuses to ignore the world, but ways of keeping hearts supple so that justice does not become brittle. Force is not a first resort, but it must be available, and when it is used, it must be put away again with an almost ceremonial care, like a sword cleaned and returned to its rack. Domestic affection is not inferior to public virtue. To protect a child or a kitchen is as holy as to defend a frontier. The Eye of Ra assigns each of these duties to a goddess who specializes and thus keeps the balance comprehensible. When the king wears the uraeus on his brow, he is not simply borrowing a superb ornament. He is taking an oath to see as the eye sees, and to act as she acts. The serpent above his forehead is Wadjet of the Delta, the cobra who spits flame at enemies. She is paired with Nekbet, the vulture of the south who spreads her wings above the diadem. Together they are called the Two Ladies, and they crown the royal titulary as a reminder that the country itself is a union of fierce protection and maternal care. In the stories, the Eye is not always compliant. She wanders to distant lands in a mood, and the world grows thirsty for her return. Priests told how she went to the south and took up residence where the sun is sharp and the storms have little patience. This is the tale of the distant goddess. The task of luring her home falls to Thoth, who argues as only Thoth can argue, with jokes and praise and small gifts of civilization. In some versions, he tells tales until the goddess forgets to be angry. In others, he brings her elegant clothing and jars of perfume and promises of music that will not end. She returns by the island of Elephantine, where the Nile narrows to talkative channels. And when she arrives, there is a festival to prove how much she was missed. The Feast of Drunkenness at Dendera remembers that homecoming. It is not simply an excuse to be silly. It is a lesson that joy can heal relations between heaven and earth, when sternness has done what it can and must rest. The procession that welcomes the Eye back into the temple is designed with the concentration of a military operation. Timing matters. Songs matter. The faces of the musicians matter, and the shape of the cups, and the balance between delight and dignity. The Eye is also a principle hidden in the smallest things that carry the sun's favor. A tiny image of a cobra coiled around a loop becomes a charm of heat and guardianship. A golden disc atop a standard becomes the portable presence of the god in a bark that glitters through streets. The wedge of triangular shadow cast by an obelisk at noon becomes a visible reminder that light has edges and can be measured and trained. The Eye looks out from painting and relief and jewelry and amulet, and she looks back at the one who looks, as if asking whether the household and the city are behaving like friends of order. Mothers teach their daughters to shake the sistrum with a steady hand and keep rhythm for the little processions of daily life. Doctors address their first prayer to Sekhmet before they set a bone. A merchant ties a cat charm around his account bag because he wishes to keep the rats of temptation away from the grain of his honesty. When miners in Sinai carve a supplication to Hathor on rock, they call her Lady of Turquoise and Lady of the Sycamore and Lady of the West, which is a way of saying she is present in beauty and in shade and in the afterlife, and that the same kindness runs through all three like a thread. Egyptian theology is hospitable. It welcomes other names to the same task. Tefnut, the moisture that keeps the morning kind, can also be the Eye when the world needs a stern dew. Mut of Thebes, consort of Amun, wears the double crown and the disc, and takes her turn at the brow of the Sunday. Wadjet, as already seen, is the Eye when a king must show that his patience is not to be mistaken for fear. Even the seven Hathors belong in this company, those fateful ladies who announce the destinies of newborns and tell fortunes in dark places. Their role is to make sure that joy has a schedule and that luck does not arrive so late it is useless. All these variants speak a single language. The eye is the part of the sun that pays attention. There is a quiet contrast that helps the mind keep its footing. The eye of Ra is not the same as the eye of Horus. The latter, called the sound eye or the Wedjat, is the healed emblem taken from the story of Horus and Seth, a sign of restoration that appears on coffins and ointment pots and the stems of offering tables. It belongs to the arithmetic of wholeness. The eye of Ra belongs to the arithmetic of action. One promises that what was shattered can be mended. The other promises that what is wicked can be stopped. Both find their way into households and tombs and courts, and both appear on the faces of children whose mothers like to think in symbols while tying a cord around a wrist. The arts took to these goddesses with a seriousness that looks like affection. Relief carvers gave Hathor a mouth that seems about to laugh without disrespect. Painters gave Bastet eyes that catch light even when the room is dim. Sculptors gave Sekhmet a jaw that says she will try patience before punishment, and a forearm that says she will not try forever. Musicians found that the sistrum does for people what a good breeze does for sails. It lifts without shouting. Dancers discovered that a line of women stepping together can dry tears faster than arguments can. Scribes wrote hymns that are unashamedly warm, and prayers that ask for protection with the honesty of a child who does not tidy her room before pleading for help. In these songs, the eye is praised for being both a lion and a nurse, both a cat and a torch. Because Egypt loved to fold ideas into kingship, the royal house shared in this devotion. Queens were praised as great wives of the king and as living Hathors who could soothe tempers and keep the palace human. Royal daughters served as priestesses who shook the sistrum before the bark and steadied the city by doing so. Kings who built vast courts often set aside a chapel in which Sekhmet could watch to the east with the kind of focus that scares nonsense back into corners. In some reigns, you can chart the mood of the land by the proportion of lioness statues to cows. In others, you can taste it in the number of festivals where the beer cups were polished and the harp strings replaced. So the eye of Ra is never a single mask. It is a promise fulfilled in many rooms, in the mine where men come home with blue fingers and cracked lips, in the clinic where a fever is broken with water and a charm, in the house where a child laughs because the cat stretches on the threshold, in the court where a magistrate feels a gaze at his back and decides the case on its merits, in the temple where 100 faces of Hathor smile down from column tops like lamps that never go out. The sun sends a face to each of these tasks, and the city learns to see them as one household duty: delighting the people, defending the law, domesticating the day. There is a story that Egyptians love to tell when they wish to remind themselves that power is not only muscle and fire, but also patience with a very good memory. It begins in an afternoon of the gods, when Ra had grown old enough to feel the sun as a weight. His saliva fell on the earth in a moment of weariness, and Isis, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, gathered that glistening trace and mixed it with clay. She was already the mistress of words and of healing, a scholar of herbs with a mind that measured causes and effects as neatly as a scribe counts grain. From the little mud she formed a serpent and placed it in the path that Ra would take when he walked with his retinue at the cool of day. The snake struck him as he passed. The poison rose like fire through his limbs, and the Great One cried out in a voice that made the sky remember how to tremble. The lesser gods panicked. They called for the magicians. They called for words of power. None of it was sufficient, because the wound was not a wound of flesh. It was a question. Isis came forward with the calm of someone who has already solved the problem. She bent her knee and placed her hands near the stricken god without touching him, because good physicians know that dignity must be left intact even when pain has made a ruin of composure. She said that she could remove the venom, but such a cure required a true name. Ra recited victories and epithets in a rush. He is the maker of light. He is the Lord of crowns. He is the one who first stood upon the mound when the waters were an endless sleep. Isis listened with respectful boredom and said that these were beautiful titles and very useful for festivals, but they were not the thing itself. The god who knows the secret syllables of his own being can never be helpless. The god who refuses to speak them must find another doctor. In the end, Ra conceded. He sent his retinue away. He asked Isis to hide his mouth from the gaze of the world, and he whispered to her the word that was not a word, but the axis of his existence. She took it into herself like a lamp hidden under a cloak, and she spoke the counterspell, and the poison left his body by the same door through which it had come. The Lord of the Sun was made whole because he had chosen knowledge over pride. This bargain did not diminish him. It civilized the world. A god who cannot trust another will become a tyrant or will fall into a silence that starves his subjects. By sharing himself, Ra acknowledged what creation had already made true, that the keeping of order is a shared duty. Isis did not hoard the secret like a dragon sleeping on coins. She passed it to her son Horus in due time, which is to say, she passed it to the principle of rightful rule. When kings called themselves the son of Ra, they spoke more than a flattery. They claimed an inheritance of names. They promised to govern with a wisdom that can heal rather than simply command. That is what the myth says in its sleek and clever way. It says that a crown is not enough. A ruler must know how to ask for the right name at the right moment, and must be willing to say it aloud in the presence of truth. Egyptians trusted this story because it aligns with their understanding of speech. A name is not a label in that tradition. It is a force. To speak a name is to invite a thing to remember itself. Temples used this grammar with a discipline that would have pleased the most exacting craftsman. Priests addressed the sun at dawn with titles suited to birth, at noon with titles suited to judgment, at evening with titles suited to completion, and at night with titles suited to endurance. The name passed from Ra to Isis, then from Isis to Horus, became the golden thread that ran through kingship and liturgy. It insisted that there is always a precise phrase that will persuade the world to behave, and that the art of finding that phrase belongs to the wise. It also made the serpent into a tutor. A creature of cunning had pierced the Great One, and drawn from him a humility that strengthened the realm. The symbol took hold. On ointment jars, and on caskets, and on the rims of offering tables, the smooth eye of Horus appears as a sign that broken parts can be mended, and that completeness has a shape one can learn to draw by heart. On royal brows, the coiled cobra looks outward and dares trouble to approach. 2 eyes, 2 lessons, each indispensable. Once the tale of the hidden name is understood, the other serpent stories shift into clarity. Apophis rises from the first water like a bad intention and waits beside the channels of the underworld to swallow tomorrow whole. He is not a god to be worshipped, but a hunger to be resisted. The books of night, whose texts are painted on the walls of royal tombs and transcribed on coffin panels, treat him with exact courtesy. There are charts for the hour when he strikes and spells for the knots that bind him. There are knives that must be new and cords that must be twisted in a certain way, and wax figures that must be molded and stamped and burned at the proper points. Priests performed these rites in small rooms while the city slept, not because the sun needed rescue, but because friendship required solidarity. They addressed Apophis by names that limit him: worm of the horizon, roarer in the deep, body swelled with wind. Names that weaken his appetite by refusing to speak the lie that he is grand. Set took his station on the night boat and harpooned the serpent with a skill that few expected from a god of storms, which is a delicate reminder that the world uses even its rough tools for good when guided by a firm hand. Mayan, the protective serpent who coils around the shrine of the god, held back the sudden strike of venom without pausing to boast. By dawn, the binders had done their work, and the prow slid free. And in the painted caverns of the kings, the coil of the enemy lies slack as a length of rotten rope tossed aside after a long argument. Not every serpent is an enemy. Wadjet rears on the brow of the king and spits fire at those who would cheat the scales. The uraeus curls above the crowns of goddesses who guard as well as adore. Mayan guards the heart of the bark at night with a patience that never tires. Even the snake that Isis made from the saliva of the sun performs a holy task, because it extracted from greatness the promise that greatness would listen. This is the Egyptian way with symbols. Nothing is condemned for its shape. Everything is judged by its use. A knife is an instrument for carving bread, and also a weapon that must be locked away when anger rises. A serpent is a coil of malice in the dark, and also a living flame upon a diadem. The teller of tales keeps the distinctions clean, and the worshipper learns which images to invite into the house. The scene of Isis and the hidden name appears in different texts with small variations and with the same gleaming premise. The goddess who is great of magic does not win by brute force. She wins by making a question that cannot be ignored and by being ready to catch the answer when it comes. In one telling, she swears to keep the true name veiled and uses it only to cure and to enthrone. In another, she teaches it to Horus so that his right to rule is not a matter of claws and beaks, but a matter of knowing how the world is spelled. Either way, the serpent is not an embarrassment to be removed from the story. It is a reminder that discomfort can be a teacher when wisdom is in the room. The bite made the god speak. The word made the wound remember how to close. From this braid of myths came rituals as precise as surgery. In houses where sickness took hold, a healer might whisper a version of the words that had soothed the burning in the body of the Sunday. In courts where judgment faltered, a priest might recite a hymn of the true names of Ra at noon to remind the hall that clarity is possible. In royal chambers where heirs were presented to the people, the rites would include declarations that the breath of Ra dwelt in the new ruler, not as a boast but as a pledge to speak rightly. In tombs, chapters were written that place the eye of Horus on the lips of the dead, so that speech will not fail when answers are required. And that set the cobra on the brow of the coffin so that malice will keep a respectful distance. In these practices, the serpent is both caution and comfort. And Isis stands behind them with the look of someone who loves a clever plan, but loves an honest cure even more. The river carried these stories from one shrine to another, and the people learned to live by their quiet instruction. If you are wounded, seek the name of your wound and speak it without lies. If chaos rears up, bind it with habit and with friends and with measured words rather than with panic. If you are given authority, do not be content with titles. Ask for the knowledge that lets a title do something useful. The image of Isis holding her hand before the mouth of Ra, while he whispers what only she may hear, is an image for every compact that makes a household graceful. It is the moment when pride agrees to be advised, and when cleverness agrees to be gentle. The serpent that strikes is an inconvenience that becomes a lesson. The serpent that crowns is a duty that becomes a joy. If a temple in Egypt seems to breathe, it is because it was built to remember the first breath that stirred the waters of Nun and raised the mound into light. Every sacred enclosure is a model of the cosmos in workable scale, a geography that turns the acts of worship into the maintenance manual of creation. The entrance pylon stands like twin hills with the disk of the sun rising between them. The courts are bright, like riverbanks at noon. Colonnades recall palm groves that never drop their leaves. The sanctuary is small and secret as the moment before dawn. To found such a house, the king and the goddess of writing, who is Seshat, take a cord and stretch it in the sight of stars. The right is exact. The cord sets the axis. The stakes find the corners. The star of the north steadies the eye. This ceremony of stretching the cord repeats the first time so that stone can obey the same laws that light obeys. A temple aligned to the sky keeps the day and the year honest in the city beneath its walls. The House of Ra at Heliopolis was a fountainhead for this kind of building. Priests there loved to place a stone on the roof that caught the first ray at sunrise, a reminder that the Benben, the first mound, still shines. The sacred bull called Mnevis grazed in his court as the living muscle of the Sunday. At festivals, the small bark of Ra left its chamber and crossed an open court that was designed to be warmed rather than shaded, because a house of the sun should not hide from the very thing it honors. In the 5th dynasty, kings raised special sun temples on the plain near the city. These had open platforms and obelisks where altars stood in daylight. Priests described them as fields of offerings under the sky, with low walls and great basins for libations and processions that circled like the hours of the day. The idea was simple and profound. If the sun sustains life, the heart of his cult should be a place where sunlight can sit down and be fed with praise. Obelisks are the purest speech in this language of stone. They are rays of the sun given a body that will not weather. Each stood upon a low pedestal and ended in a point that bore a smooth cap of electrum to catch the morning blaze. Their sides were carved with the names of a king and with prayers that rose like swallows from the chisel. When two were set at a gate, the approach became a corridor of brightness, and every passerby understood that this was a border between ordinary time and the time that breathes in hymns. Heliopolis was famous for them, but Thebes learned their lesson with zeal. Hatshepsut raised a pair at Karnak that answered the dawn like polished reeds, and the priests wrote that they were fashioned in a single season as a boast that will never quite be matched. Even in ruins, an obelisk preserves a manners lesson for light. It shows how radiance can be trained without being diminished. Kingship lived inside these designs as a calling more than a privilege. The royal titulary was a string of promises braided into names. The Horus name tied the king to the eye of the falcon that surveys the land from above. The two ladies' name joined him to the vulture and the cobra, which are the goddesses of the south and the north, so that the two lands might stay reconciled under his body like papyrus and lotus knotted on a throne. The golden Horus name praised endurance in triumph. The throne name was written in a cartouche and crowned with the name of Ra, a quiet but relentless claim that kingship would keep its face in the Sunday. The birth name often proclaimed son of Ra, so that no one could mistake the source of breath in the royal chest. Sahure, who ruled in the 5th dynasty, wrote his closeness to Ra into his very name. Neferekari made beauty and the spirit of Ra into one word. Nuseri took his joy from the sun and spread it across courts and altars. Centuries later, Ramesses announced himself to the world as born of Ra, and then built until his stones sounded like marching. The palace was called the Great House, and from that phrase came the word pharaoh. The king was not merely a person who sat behind a gate. He was a participant in rites that turned the city into a functioning image of the sky. At dawn, he offered Mat to Ra for the country, which is to say, he promised to keep justice and balance as carefully as a priest keeps the flame from sputtering. At the new year, he ran in a courtyard to show that his legs were still friendly to the ground, because a land this long and a calendar this patient demand physical proof of vigor. In the said festival, which came after many years of rule, he was renewed with rites that unfroze joints and reaffirmed bearings. He sat one moment in a pavilion of reeds, as if creation were still damp and newborn, and the next he stood with crowns of both lands, as if he were the bridge that holds the Nile together. These scenes look theatrical when cut from their purpose. Within the temples they were grammar and engine. They reminded the country that the person in the crown was a gear that must mesh with the greater works of sun and flood. Temples had cities inside them. Storehouses kept grain measured so that festivals could be fed and so that lean years could be cheated of severity. Gardens gave sweetness to offerings. Workshops made everything from a golden shrine plank as thin as a leaf to a linen bandage that would swaddle a statue of the god at night. The House of Life, which was the temple school, copied hymns and drew maps of the underworld and taught young scribes to make straight columns of signs that looked like ropes and waterways. The high priest of Ra at Heliopolis and the high priests of Amun in Thebes were not only readers of difficult texts, they were stewards of land and men and policy. Their duty was to keep the rites breathing so that courts would be honest and markets would not lose their scales. In the Valley of the Kings, the walls of royal tombs glowed with books of night that gave the sun a chart and the pharaoh a path. In the pyramid temples of earlier ages, the reliefs wrote the harvest and the ship lists and the cattle trail as offerings laid upon a cosmic table. The stones record both theology and barley. Even the monuments that face the desert speak this solar language. The Great Sphinx looks east with a patience that outlasts kings. Later, Egyptians called him Horus of the Horizon and joined his strength with Ra to make Ra Horakhti, the sun as it stands at the meeting of dawn and dusk. A prince who slept in the shelter of his paw dreamed that the god promised a crown if the sand were cleared from the body of the lion. He woke, took spade and royal energy to the drifted dunes, and set up a stele that calls the guardian by names of the Sunday. The Sphinx becomes in this telling a boulder that learned to speak, a hill that took an oath to watch the eastern gate forever. The pyramids themselves were named with solar words. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was called the Horizon of Khufu, as if the king and the sunrise had become partners in keeping the country confident. On a clear morning, you may stand at Giza and feel the sun climb the angle of ancient thought. Karnak in Thebes deserves a long morning of attention because it is a dictionary of this theology carved in stone. Its axes answer the river, and the Sunday its pylons gather light and release it into shadow. The obelisks of Hatshepsut were gilded so that they did not simply endure the day but spoke back to it. The long courts where Amun and Mut and Khonsu keep company teach how a local cult can be braided with the light so tightly that the names behave like kin. Festivals paraded the god from Karnak to Luxor along a road of sphinxes. In that procession, the bond between the sun hidden within Amun and the breath of the king was renewed. Crowds shouted with a friendly piety that made the very air seem to take sides with life. In this way, even when Thebes used the name Amun for the power behind the day, the words Amun-Ra made clear that the sun was the badge and the engine of might. The daily service at every temple repeats this contract between throne and disk. Priests wake the image at dawn, bathe and dress it, feed it real food that becomes the wages of those who serve, and carry it in a little bark along routes that shine with paint and memory. Kings attend on festival days with gestures that are old and exact. He smites the enemies of order in a scene that is understood as proof of courage rather than bloodlust. He presents incense, which is the food of breath. He pours water, which is the kindness of the Nile translated into a jar. He raises a Diyade pillar in a ceremony of stability that joins him to Osiris, and then by the surest path to the sun who grants mornings. He cuts the ribbon to open a hypostyle hall, a thing both ordinary and grand, because to open a gate for the god is to open a season for the country. In every act, the message is the same. The temple is a working model. The king is a working part. The sun approves because the gears are oiled with mart. Over centuries, the language of stone and ritual kept its accent, though the voices changed. The kings of the 5th dynasty favored Ra with new names and lit courts. The builders of the Middle Kingdom folded solar hymns into their stelae so that winter hearts might be warmed by reading. The great warrior kings of the New Kingdom set obelisks at gates and carved long lists of captives on walls. as if to reassure the sun that the borders were under control, and that morning would never be ashamed to rise over the fields. Even in late days, when Greek speech murmured in markets and Rome set its might upon the Mediterranean, the Egyptian habit of aligning houses to the sky and of writing the name of Ra into royal vows persisted with a stubborn grace. Visitors could tell that this was not a country that borrowed the day. It was a country that lent the day to newcomers and taught them how to greet it. So temples and kingship were not ornaments to faith. They were the instruments by which sunlight and justice were kept in tune. The obelisk instructed the morning. The pylon shaped the first hour. The sanctuary guarded the moment before speech. The king carried breath from altar to court and back again. The priests counted stars and balanced ledgers. The people watched and joined and believed, because the results were visible in barley and in treaties, and in the good manners of weather. Egypt made of worship a public service. The sun repaid the courtesy by remembering the road. Egypt was never shy about letting one bright truth wear several faces. The sun that rose at dawn, judged at noon, and comforted at evening, invited a theology that preferred union to rivalry. Priests did not abolish older gods when a new insight arrived. They married them. They braided attributes. They taught that a single radiance could be approached as many friendly persons, each with a specialty and a seat in a different city. In that spirit, Ra took companions inside his very name, and those companions changed the religious map without breaking it. The oldest blend is almost a grammar lesson. Khepri Ra speaks of the sun as it presses out of night with the stubborn cheer of the scarab. Ra Harakti means Horus of the horizons joined to the midday power, the falcon who holds both east and west in one wide gaze. Atum Ra is the evening completeness that has laid down its hurry and keeps its promises in a lower voice. These names are not mere labels. They are instructions to worship and to art and to architecture. A chapel that opens to the first beam favors Khepri. A court that blazes at noon belongs to Ra Harakti. A shrine that swallows light in a gentle dusk precedes Atum. The litany of Ra gives each form a series of titles and epithets, as if a jeweler were turning a gem and noting the play of color. The greatest weaving of all took place in Thebes. Amun was the hidden one, a god of inward power, of wind without face, of the strength that arrives quietly behind events. When Thebes rose to empire, its priests taught that the secret potency of Amun and the public blaze of Ra were one life. Amun-Ra became king of the gods, and the long axes of Karnak were aligned to prove that invisibility and daylight are not quarrels, but partners. The bark of Amun was fitted with a disc, and with the rearing cobra, and with the emblems of breath and vigor. Festivals drew him out of darkness into courts where the sun could applaud. Queens were named for this union. Kings swore by it. The hymns call Amun the hidden one whose face is Ra, a neat phrase that places a mystery at the heart of every noon. Elsewhere, the sun learned local accents without losing his grammar. In the Fayum, the crocodile lord Sobek gained a solar crown and became Sobek Ra, a reminder that the river's muscle and the sky's fire can serve the same order. On the island of Elephantine, where the Nile narrows to talkative channels, the ram-headed potter Khnum sometimes wore the disc and answered as Khnum Ra, a potter god who warms his clay with a master's lamp. The war god Montu flashed with solar cloth in Thebes so that victories could be credited to daylight rather than to rage. Even the great guardian of Giza took a sun title. The Sphinx became Horus of the horizon, and with Ra completed the name Ra Harakti, a statement in limestone that dawn and lion strength are the same household. Scholars point out that these unions were never careless. They were argued, inscribed, sung, and then enacted in stone. A chapel added behind an older sanctuary did not erase what came before. It drew a thread from it. New pylons framed old courts so that the early voice continued to speak within the later voice. Priests in Memphis, who loved the craft of Ptah, could say with a straight face that Ptah thought the world in his heart and spoke it with his tongue, and then that Ra lit what Pa had made. The world is safer when both facts are true. The country consented because the results were visible in harvests and in law, and in a temper that preferred repair to quarrel. One experiment broke that temper, and thereby showed its value. Akhenaten, who first bore the name Tutankhaten as a prince, raised the worship of the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, to an exclusivity that dissolved the older family bonds. Temples without roofs opened themselves to raw light. The Aten was drawn as a round brilliance that extended many rays, each tipped with a little hand that offered a sign of life. The great hymn to the Aten celebrates the globe as a poet celebrates breath itself. It praises every creature that wakes because the light has touched it. In those lines there is a freshness that even critics admire. But the king closed older sanctuaries, moved the court to a new city, and insisted that the Aten alone should be served. The people learned that union is not the same as erasure. When he died, the court returned to Thebes. The boy king took the older name Tutankhamen, and the priests opened the shrines that had kept the household of the gods in practice for centuries. The son remained beloved, but once more as the elder in a large human family rather than a solitary sovereign. The solar idea did not stop at Egypt's borders. Greek visitors who had already sung to Helios and Apollo discovered in Ra a cousin who had been ruling a very long time. When Alexander came, he went to the oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis and greeted the god as Zeus Ammon, a blend that shows how ideas travel better than armies. In Alexandria, the Ptolemaic kings sponsored Serapis, a composite deity of Osiris and bull and Greek makeweight, and even that cautious invention borrowed solar dignity when it suited the moment. Rome treasured Egyptian pillars. Emperors ferried obelisks across the sea and stood them in circuses and forums, as if to import the very manners of mourning. The Lateran obelisk had served Thutmose III. The one that rose in the Circus Maximus spoke once for Ramesses II. The polished needle that gleams in the sun before the great church of St. Peter was raised in the time of Augustus, and then later again by a Renaissance engineer who treated it with a respect any pharaoh would have recognized. Even the city's calendar confessed a solar memory. The day of the sun stood separate in Roman speech, and the halo that shines around saints in later paintings has cousins in the disk and the nimbus that once crowned Egyptian gods in relief. Through late centuries, the Egyptian hymns to the sun kept being copied because they read like instruction as well as praise. The litany of Ra travels with Seti in his tomb, and with Ramesses II and others besides, a procession of names that serve as anchors for the night and as titles for the day. On papyri for private burials, a hymn to Ra at his rising is placed near a chapter that lets a soul go out by day. The old confidence persists. Light is a relationship that can be kept if both parties remember their duties. Even as Greek found its way into the markets and Latin into garrisons, local scribes kept writing Ra with the same sure signs, a mouth for speech and an arm for power, and a circle for the brilliance that needs no translation. The landscape also remembers. Heliopolis dwindled as a city, but the idea of a house of the sun never ran out of appetite. Every new settlement that faced east with care was an echo. Every doorway that admitted one beam on a chosen day was a scholar paying homage. Travelers carried the rumor of such exactness with them. Architects in lands far from the Nile learned to make buildings that welcome morning and protect noon and negotiate evening with a tact that has an Egyptian accent. When the old obelisks were raised in foreign squares, their inscriptions continued to speak. Names of kings survived on faces that felt strange winds, and the prayers cut in the stone still attempted their old work. which is to tell light that it is loved and that it is expected to behave. In popular imagination, the god never retired. He became a figure in poems and operas and novels. He appears in the study of magicians, in the library of symbolists, in the pocketbook of tourists who rub a little green scarab bought in a souk and think about dawn. Scholars of religion continue to use him as a compass for comparing how civilizations understand creation, law, and renewal. Children meet him in picture books where a falcon-headed lord smiles from clear pages. Filmmakers have tried their version of his boat and of his enemies in the dark. Most of these retellings are affectionate even when inaccurate, because the central thought refuses to be spoiled by a clumsy costume. The sun is a character in our story, whether we write his name as Ra or not. We all rise because he does. There is a quieter endurance that belongs not to image but to habit. People still turn their faces to morning with a gratitude that is older than any liturgy. Farmers still watch the year by the light and the water. Judges still know that the noon of clear sight is the only hour worth imitating. Cities still mark their proudest spaces with shafts that catch the sky and with courtyards that present themselves like open hands. The moral of the Egyptian experiment has not dated. Unity is stronger than uniformity. Order thrives when it can sing as well as scold. A great power that delegates remains great for longer. A ruler who is willing to share his true name with wisdom will heal what force cannot. When Egyptians placed the feather of Ma'at before the face of the sun, they were saying that truth and light belong in the same sentence. It is a sentence that continues to be worth reading aloud. Ra's name travels, therefore, without losing its home. It is at once a word that sounds best in the echoing room of a pylon, and a thought that any person can carry across a field at dawn. The god who sat upon the back of the celestial cow, who sailed on 2 boats through the day and the night, who wore the faces of beetle and falcon and elder, who entrusted his eye to daughters, who delighted and defended the world, and who learned to reign from the height of the sky rather than the dust of courtyards, has left a manor more than a monument. The manor is simple without being easy. Keep the road of the sun open. Keep the world honest. Make room for joy. Teach force to obey wisdom. Then the morning will remember you.